So I promised this next set of lessons was about how to get a raise. Let's start with a lesson on how not to do it. The folks asking for a raise don't really talk about how much extra product or service they're going to produce, do they? Anyway, the first part of this lecture should be review. I'm hoping you all remember marginal physical product. That is, the output added by hiring an additional worker if everything else is held constant. Like almost everyone who has ever worked for a corporation, I love Dilbert cartoons. Note that this cartoon is actually suggesting that the marginal physical product of the two additional workers on the team might be negative, since they're going to add 3 months to the production process, and after that they will be, quote, as useful as this meeting. In reality, of course, firms don't set out to hire workers if they aren't going to provide any marginal product or service. But what employees asking for raises really need to understand and really need to reference is their marginal revenue product. That's the additional revenue that comes into the cash register as a result of hiring an additional employee. I told you during my lessons on competitive markets that you needed to put the following piece of information into your hard drive. Firms maximize profits by producing up to the point where marginal revenue, which for competitive markets is price, equals marginal cost. So here's the hard drive message for this lesson. Firms hire up to the point where marginal revenue product equals the prevailing wage. As long as a new worker is bringing in more money than he or she costs, or in econ speak, as long as the new worker's marginal revenue product is higher than his or her wage, then it makes sense to hire more workers. So the marginal revenue product curve actually turns out to be the firm's demand curve for labor. That's what's called a derived demand, derived from another demand. So one year I had a student come up to me after class, kind of excited, and he told me that he had actually used my argument about marginal revenue product with his boss. He said he explained how much money he was making for his boss, what his marginal revenue product was, and he argued that his marginal revenue product entitled him to a raise, and if my student was not fibbing, he got the raise. Now, I did no fact-checking on this story. It was much too good to fact-check. I'm guessing that if this really did happen, and I hope it did, that the employer was so bemused by a high school student talking about marginal revenue product that he gave in, or he had, in fact, already been planning to give the student a raise. At any rate, it's important to understand that the flip side is also true. An employer will not pay an employee more than he or she brings in. And how much he or she brings in is going to depend on both that worker's productivity and on the market price for the product. Again, a derived demand. So I used the term prevailing market wage. Now I want to talk about what that term actually means. It may seem to you that wages are pretty arbitrary, but in fact employers can't just pick any wage rate in an industry determined by labor supply and demand. Of course, there are huge numbers of labor supply and demand curves, depending not only on the skills of the workers, but also on the availability of workers in different fields. Wages also vary a lot geographically. My son-in-law is a biochemist who works in the biotech industry. To my delight, and therefore my daughter and adorable grandson just moved from Anaheim to the San Francisco Bay Area, where he took a job with a new biotech firm. He got a substantial raise, which almost certainly reflected higher prevailing wage rates for similar work in Silicon Valley. But my daughter and son-in-law also soon discovered that a lot of that raise was going to be eaten up by the huge difference in cost of living between Southern California and Silicon Valley. There's a reason why firms have to offer different wages in different areas to attract the workers they need. Firms may also decide to pay more than the prevailing wage rate if they really need more workers or if they think they can get a higher marginal revenue product out of their workforce, maybe even by paying their workers more. Sorry, these building slides again. So here's another graph from the strawberry pickers example. And please understand that I have no reason to assume that these numbers have any accuracy, especially in 2014. This is also a marginal revenue graph, which makes it a labor demand graph, right? Interpreting this graph should be pretty straightforward if it'll ever finish building. It's also pretty depressing. Basically, if the prevailing wage rate for strawberry pickers is $8 an hour, then the farmer will hire 3 pickers. If it's $4 an hour, then the farmer will hire five pickers. I think we're done there. Are we done? There we go. At this point, you should have a better understanding of the challenge facing strawberry pickers and Walmart workers and fast food line and counter workers. I am not arguing that these workers are always paid the full marginal revenue product of the last worker hired. But these jobs are not high productivity jobs. They rely heavily on human labor rather than work multiplying machine power. And the items being sold are not, for the most part, high-priced goods. Yeah, fresh strawberries are a bit of a luxury, but like most hand-picked fresh fruits and vegetables, they're a luxury that consumers will forego if the price gets too high, and for that matter, they're a luxury the low-income workers already can't afford. Fast food meals, likewise, aren't just fast, they're usually pretty cheap. If that quarter pounder or 6-inch sub sandwich gets a lot more expensive compared with other food options, demand will suffer, and with it, marginal revenue product. And of course, we already know that Walmart competes mostly on the basis of its low prices. So, how could strawberry pickers do better? They would be better off if marginal revenue product in their industry increased and therefore shifted the marginal revenue curve to the right. And that could happen in 2 ways. I want to make sure this graph doesn't go away. First, it could happen due to improvements in productivity that raised marginal physical product, such as conveyor belts, mentioned in one of the articles I used in the reading quiz. Second, it could happen if the demand for strawberries increased and the price went up. So let's try to interpret the graph. If the farm continued to employ 5 workers, they could now ask for a wage rate of $6 an hour, or the farm might hire a 6th worker and keep the wage rate at $4. Which of these 2 possibilities occurs depends on labor supply. If lots more workers are willing to work at the lower wage, the result will probably be more employment but no more pay. If a farm can't hire more workers at $4 an hour, or if minimum wage laws prevent this, then the farm will not add workers but will pay the ones it employs more. The potential impact of a minimum wage is a big question and a big topic. It's one I'm going to save for next class and your second essay. Oops, sorry. So instead of wading into the minimum wage debate at this point, I'm going to look more closely at marginal revenue product and review the kind of problems you will encounter on your practice labor market quiz today and your real labor market quiz tomorrow. This is the strawberry chart again. You'll see that total revenue is price times output, as always, and marginal revenue product is how much that total revenue goes up with the addition of each worker. What isn't as clear from this chart, since it doesn't include marginal physical product, is that marginal revenue product is also marginal physical product, the amount of additional stuff produced by an additional worker, times price, times what you can get for that additional stuff. Again, it makes sense. Marginal revenue per worker is the additional product the worker produces times the price of that product. Sorry, I'm getting tangled up. So I made my own chart. This is for our old friend Goop, but I've added marginal physical product to make the point clearer. By the way, I'm posting these PowerPoints on Moodle if it would help you to be able to look at them more closely. You'll also see similar charts on your practice quiz. So here's the same chart with total revenue filled in. You now know how to calculate total revenue, right? It's price per pound times quantity in pounds. You don't need the information on wages yet, but you will. So now I've filled in marginal physical product. That's just the change in output with each added worker, right? And now the chart is completely filled in. If you check, you'll see that you get the same answer for marginal revenue product if you use subtraction to calculate the change in total revenue, or if you use multiplication, multiply marginal physical product times price. And now we get to the wages and hiring decision. If the prevailing market wage for manufacturing workers with the skills necessary to produce Goop in this area is $12 an hour, how many workers will the firm hire? the goop producer will hire 5 workers. In other words, the firm will hire up to the point where marginal revenue product equals the prevailing wage. Notice that if wages rose to $24 per hour, the firm would hire just 4 workers. But let's assume for a moment that scientists discover new and miraculous properties in goop and demand goes up. The price soars to $10 per pound. Would the firm now hire 6 workers? No. The marginal revenue product of the 6th worker is still only $10. No surprise, since we've seen that hiring 1 more worker only scores 1 more pound of goop for the firm. But notice that with 5 workers making goop, the marginal revenue product of goop is now $30. And what should goop workers do? They should ask for a raise. Before you get to work on your practice labor market quizzes, I'm going to review some of the content questions that will appear on your quiz. Remember, that is on your real quiz, not the practice quiz. Remember, you can use your notes on your book or your book for the quiz, but you're also going to have to use some reasoning power. As you saw from the last quiz on competitive markets, and I think it messed some of you up, you can't just look down at your notes and glance and click on the answer. You need to think about how what you've learned applies. So make sure you understand, for example, why the supply curve for labor is sloped upward and what the opportunity cost of labor is. Talked about that in my previous lecture. Now you know that the negatively or downwardly sloped demand curve for labor is actually the marginal revenue product curve. But why does it slope downward? In other words, why is there an inverse relationship between the marginal revenue product and the number of workers hired? What does an equilibrium wage rate really mean? Does it mean that workers are happy with the wage? Does it mean that employers are happy with the wage? Or is it simply the market clearing wage at which supply and demand for labor equal out and everybody is employed, maybe even at a very low wage? Don't forget to finish up the other reading quizzes for this unit if you haven't already, and to take the competitive market quizzes again if you haven't already. We are getting close to the finish line and to graduation.